He bowed his head, only to slit the king's throat. Part 1: The Broken Trophy. What is the most dangerous posture a man can take? It isn't standing tall with a weapon. It is bowing his head. Because when a man bows, you can no longer see his eyes, or what he is hiding behind his back. Today, we decode the dark psychology of weaponized submission. Victor Sterling was the undisputed king of American media. As the ruthless CEO of Sterling Global in New York, Victor didn't just beat his competitors, he completely humiliated them. 5 years ago, a brilliant young tech founder named Elias Thorne almost disrupted Victor's entire empire with a revolutionary algorithm. In response, Victor launched a massive, illegal smear campaign, drove Elias's company into bankruptcy, and buried Elias under millions in fabricated legal debts. But Victor didn't stop there. Driven by a sadistic ego, Victor offered Elias a choice: go to federal prison, or work directly for him as a personal strategist to pay off the debt. Elias chose the latter. For 5 years, Elias became Victor's favorite living trophy. Victor paraded him in front of elite board members, forcing the former genius to pour his coffee, carry his bags, and publicly agree with his decisions. Every single day, Elias bowed his head, absorbed the brutal insults, and played the role of the broken, defeated servant to absolute perfection. Victor believed that by crushing Elias's pride, he had permanently extracted his fangs. He was catastrophically wrong. Elias wasn't broken. Every time Elias bowed his head to hide his face, he was hiding a cold, calculating smile. While Victor was busy enjoying the daily ego trip of ordering a genius around, Elias was secretly using his high-level executive clearance to map the exact digital and financial architecture of Sterling Global. He memorized server access codes, identified the hidden offshore accounts, and documented Victor's illegal bribes. Elias didn't take the job to pay off his debt. He took the job because he knew the absolute fastest way to destroy an impenetrable fortress is to let the king invite you inside. How does a hyper-vigilant billionaire let a lethal enemy sleep in his own house? In dark psychology, this is known as the trophy complex and submission camouflage. When a narcissist completely defeats a rival, their brain requires constant validation of that victory. By keeping Elias close and forcing him to submit daily, Victor received a massive dopamine rush of absolute superiority. This arrogant chemical high completely shut down his brain's threat detection system. Elias understood that the predator's ego is his biggest blind spot. By offering Victor the illusion of total dominance, Elias made himself completely invisible. The first law of power in the game of revenge: never keep a defeated enemy in your castle as a pet. A hungry wolf forced to wear a collar does not magically turn into a loyal dog. It simply learns the exact layout of your house, patiently waiting for you to fall asleep. Part 2: The Invisible Ghost. What is the perfect heist? It isn't fighting your way through the heavily armed front door. It is convincing the arrogant king to carry you inside his own vault. Today, we decode the dark art of the physical backdoor and the lethal danger of invisible access. Victor Sterling spared no expense on cybersecurity. Sterling Global's Manhattan headquarters possessed a military-grade firewall, biometric server rooms, and a highly paid IT defense team. Rival hackers had tried for years to breach his network, only to fail miserably. But Victor made one fatal logistical error. Because he wanted to constantly humiliate his defeated rival, the former tech genius was reduced to being Victor's glorified bag carrier. Elias carried Victor's encrypted laptops, set up his secure boardroom presentations, and managed his personal devices. To Victor and his elite security guards, Elias was just a broken servant. He was treated like a piece of office furniture, completely ignored by the high-level executives as he crawled under mahogany tables to plug in power cords before major board meetings. Victor thought he was wasting a genius's potential on menial tasks to feed his own ego. He was spectacularly wrong. Elias wasn't just plugging in presentation monitors. Elias had physically hollowed out Victor's expensive charging cables and wireless presentation clickers, replacing their interiors with custom-built micro-transmitters. Every single time Elias submissively knelt under a boardroom table to plug Victor's laptop into the secure corporate intranet, he was bypassing the billion-dollar firewall from the inside. He was injecting a silent, self-replicating, ghost algorithm, directly into the company's mainframe. Elias didn't need to hack the impenetrable system from the outside. Victor was literally demanding that Elias plug the weapon directly into the heart of the empire every single morning. How does a brilliant CEO let a known tech genius compromise his entire network? In dark psychology, this is known as role entrenchment and inattentional blindness. Once Victor mentally categorized Elias as a defeated servant, his brain completely stopped processing Elias as a cybersecurity threat. We do not scrutinize people who are performing mundane, submissive tasks for us. The ego blinds the predator. Victor was so focused on the sadistic pleasure of dominating Elias that he completely failed to recognize the extreme, unrestricted physical access he was voluntarily handing to his greatest enemy. The second law of power in the game of revenge: the lowest status often grants the highest access. The multi-million-dollar lock on your front door is completely useless if you force your enemy to carry the keys to your bedroom. Part 3: The Shadow Leverage. A master predator doesn't chase its prey. It builds an invisible web in the dark and simply waits. What is more valuable to a king than billions of dollars? The dirty secrets of the men who print the money. Today, we decode the dark art of shadow leverage. With the ghost algorithm deeply embedded in Sterling Global's mainframe, Elias had unrestricted, invisible access to everything. But Elias didn't care about Victor's corporate bank accounts. He was hunting for a much deadlier currency: leverage. Victor's media empire was protected by a corrupt, untouchable network of elite Washington politicians, federal judges, and Wall Street bankers. Victor controlled these powerful men by keeping a highly classified digital vault filled with their darkest secrets, bribes, hidden scandals, and illegal offshore tax evasion. While Victor was hosting lavish Manhattan galas, Elias was just the silent, defeated servant politely refilling their champagne glasses. They didn't even look at Elias when they handed him their empty glasses. But in the digital realm, Elias's algorithm was systematically bypassing Victor's security and downloading the entire blackmail vault. Victor collected these dirty secrets to keep his allies terrified of him. But Elias didn't plan to leak these files to the press or the FBI. That would only destroy the network. Instead, Elias meticulously categorized every single sin, re-encrypting the dossiers with his own master keys. He wasn't preparing to expose Victor's army. He was quietly transferring the leashes from Victor's hands into his own. Every time a powerful senator insulted Elias or treated him like dirt, Elias simply bowed his head, smiled submissively, and accepted the humiliation. But behind that bow, Elias was mathematically calculating that he now possessed the exact digital evidence to end that senator's entire career in 3 seconds. Victor thought he owned these men with his wealth. Elias now owned their absolute survival. How do you steal an empire's foundation right under the king's nose? In dark psychology, this is known as information asymmetry and shadow leverage. Power does not belong to the loudest man in the room, nor does it belong to the man with the most money. It belongs to the man who holds the most destructive secrets. By monopolizing the blackmail material without anyone knowing, Elias shifted the true balance of power. The unexecuted threat of exposure is infinitely more powerful than the exposure itself. By holding the leverage in absolute silence, Elias became the true master of Victor's network. The third law of power in the game of revenge: a king's fortress is only as strong as the loyalty of his generals. If you secretly hold the keys to the general's darkest sins, you do not need to fight the king. You simply wait for the right moment to order his own army to execute him. Part 4: The Pinnacle Trap. How do you flawlessly destroy a king's legacy? You don't attack him while he is climbing. You wait until he reaches the absolute peak. You let him look down at the world, and then you shatter the glass beneath his feet. Today, we decode the psychology of the pinnacle trap. Victor Sterling was about to achieve ultimate media supremacy. He was finalizing a $10 billion hostile takeover of the global news network, GNN. A move that would make him the undisputed controller of American news. To finalize this historic acquisition, Victor orchestrated a massive, live-streamed press conference at his Manhattan headquarters. Hundreds of journalists and Wall Street elite were in attendance. Victor wanted to humiliate Elias one more time. He ordered Elias to write his victory speech, format the teleprompter, and stand silently in the corner of the stage like a defeated prop. Elias obeyed perfectly. For weeks, Elias drafted brilliant, ego-stroking speeches, organized the media passes, and tested the audio-visual equipment. Victor was euphoric, blinded by the blinding lights of his impending coronation. He didn't bother to have his security team double-check the broadcast servers because his broken pet was handling the technical details. Victor stepped up to the podium, flashing a multi-million-dollar smile. He began his speech, reading flawlessly from the teleprompter Elias had set up. But Elias wasn't just managing the text. He had weaponized the entire broadcasting architecture. Elias had programmed a silent, delayed trigger into the teleprompter software. When Victor proudly read the words, "Sterling Global stands for absolute transparency and integrity," the teleprompter didn't load the next sentence. It went completely black. Simultaneously, Elias's backdoor algorithm hijacked the live video feed. Instead of Victor's smiling face, the screens behind him, and the live streams reaching millions of American viewers, suddenly flashed high-resolution images of Victor's illegal offshore bank accounts, bribery receipts, and the blackmail files he used to extort federal politicians. Elias didn't just ruin a press conference, he mathematically engineered a synchronized, inescapable public suicide. Why do brilliant predators fail to see the bomb under the podium? In dark psychology, this is known as ego-induced tunnel vision and the pinnacle vulnerability. Narcissists are most vulnerable at the exact moment of their greatest triumph. The intense anticipation of supreme glory releases a massive flood of dopamine, which completely overrides the brain's critical thinking and risk assessment centers. Victor was so obsessed with wearing the crown that he never stopped to check the structural integrity of the stage. Elias understood that the best time to execute a king is not in the dark, but under the brightest spotlights, where he has nowhere to hide. The fourth law of power in the game of revenge: the higher the pedestal, the deadlier the fall. Never confuse a moment of public triumph with a moment of absolute safety. When your enemies stop fighting you and start building your stage, they are not surrendering, they are building your scaffold. Part 5: The Dead Dial Tone. What is the most terrifying sound to a powerful king? It isn't the roar of an invading army. It is the absolute, dead silence of his own generals refusing to answer his call. Today, we decode the dark psychology of the loyalty mirage and the collapse of a corrupted empire. The fallout from the hijacked live broadcast was apocalyptic. Within minutes, Sterling Global's stock plummeted, and the SEC announced an immediate emergency investigation. Victor rushed into his secure, mahogany war room and locked the heavy doors. He was panicked, but he wasn't entirely defeated. Victor still had his ultimate safety net, his untouchable network of corrupt Washington senators, federal judges, and FCC regulators. These were the powerful men whose darkest secrets Victor held in his encrypted blackmail vault. He grabbed his golden smartphone and furiously began dialing his fixers. He planned to order the judges to issue emergency media injunctions, force the politicians to kill the federal investigations, and have the FBI raid Elias's apartment. He paced the room like a caged tiger, dialing number after number, screaming threats into the phone, demanding absolute obedience from the men he owned. Every single call went straight to a cold, automated voicemail. Finally, the senior chairman of the Senate Communications Committee answered. Victor immediately barked his aggressive orders, threatening to release the senator's offshore tax evasion files if he didn't comply. The senator didn't sound scared. He sounded relieved. "The files are gone, Victor," the senator replied coldly. "Your server is empty. We don't work for you anymore. We work for the man who actually holds the keys now." Click. The dial tone echoed in the silent room. Exactly 1 hour before the press conference, Elias had discreetly emailed a sample of the re-encrypted blackmail files to every single politician in Victor's network. Attached was a simple ultimatum: abandon Victor Sterling completely, or face immediate federal exposure. Elias didn't just expose Victor. He systematically disarmed the billionaire's entire political army while Victor was getting his makeup done for the cameras. How does a king's loyal army vanish in 60 seconds? In dark psychology, this is known as extortion expiration and the hostage rebellion. Narcissistic predators like Victor mistake terror for loyalty. They believe that blackmail creates a permanent bond of submission. But blackmail merely creates a hostage situation. A hostage hates their captor and is constantly looking for an escape route. Elias understood that Victor's political allies didn't respect him, they despised him. The absolute second the leverage changed hands, the politicians didn't hesitate to let Victor burn. Elias used Victor's own weaponized fear to orchestrate a synchronized, silent mutiny. The fifth law of power in the game of revenge. Fear is a mercenary, not a loyal soldier. It fights exclusively for the man who holds the biggest weapon. If you build your empire by holding a gun to your allies' heads, do not be surprised when they hand the bullets to your executioner. Part 6: The Digital Guillotine. What is the ultimate nightmare for an untouchable billionaire? It isn't the threat of a prison cell. It is looking at his sacred bank screen and seeing the number 0. Today, we decode the dark psychology of financial execution. Victor Sterling was cornered in his mahogany war room. The politicians had abandoned him, and he could hear the sirens of the SEC and FBI echoing through the streets of Manhattan, swarming his corporate headquarters. But Victor wasn't planning to surrender. He was a survivor. He had one final, impenetrable safety net, the Ghost Protocol. Victor kept an emergency, biometric laptop locked in a hidden wall safe. It contained direct access to a $2 billion untraceable Cayman Islands slush fund. His private jet was already fueled and waiting on the tarmac at JFK Airport. All Victor had to do was scan his fingerprint, wire the $2 billion into decentralized cryptocurrency wallets, and walk out the private executive elevator. He would lose his company, but he would remain a billionaire exile on a tropical island. He rushed to the safe, ripped out the laptop, and aggressively pressed his thumb against the biometric scanner. The fingerprint was accepted, the offshore bank portal loaded, but the balance didn't say $2 billion. It read $0. Suddenly, the bank screen vanished, replaced by a pre-recorded video of Elias Thorne. Elias was sitting comfortably in a leather seat, inside Victor's own private jet. Elias smiled submissively. "I handled the offshore accounts for you, Victor," Elias whispered from the screen. "While you were busy screaming at senators, my algorithm liquidated the Cayman funds and donated every single dollar to the thousands of startup founders you illegally bankrupted, including my old company. The jet is mine now, legally purchased through a shell company. Enjoy the feds." Before Victor could even scream, the heavy mahogany doors of his office exploded open. Armed FBI agents stormed in, throwing a completely broke, penniless man to the floor. How do you mentally destroy a predator before he ever reaches a courtroom? In dark psychology, this is known as ego liquidation and absolute resource deprivation. For a grandiose narcissist like Victor, his money wasn't just currency, it was his armor, his identity, and his godhood. He believed that no matter what happened, his extreme wealth made him inherently superior to everyone else. By draining his accounts to absolute zero before the arrest, Elias didn't just trap Victor physically, he assassinated Victor's ego. Stripped of his billions, Victor was forced to experience the exact same helpless, humiliating bankruptcy he had sadistically inflicted on Elias 5 years ago. The sixth law of power in the game of revenge. A king without his treasury is just a loud man in a shiny suit. Wealth is only power if you actually control the vault. The ultimate checkmate is not locking your enemy in a cage, but ensuring he cannot afford to buy the key. Part 7: The Ashes of the Empire. What is the cheapest way to buy an impenetrable fortress? You don't negotiate with the arrogant king. You set the castle on fire. Wait for the king to be dragged away in chains, and buy the ashes for pennies. Today, we decode the dark art of the engineered power vacuum. With Victor Sterling denied bail and locked in a federal penitentiary awaiting trial, Sterling Global collapsed into absolute chaos. The stock price nosedived by 85% in a single week. Wall Street was in a state of sheer panic. The board of directors, terrified of being implicated in Victor's federal crimes and desperate to stop the financial bleeding, immediately put the entire multi-billion-dollar media empire up for a fire sale. They needed an emergency buyer with clean hands, clean money, and zero ties to Victor's corrupt administration. Enter Thorne Capital, a newly formed private equity syndicate. Armed with massive, untraceable financial backing from the exact tech founders Victor had previously bankrupted, who had miraculously recovered their capital through anonymous offshore donations. This syndicate offered to buy Sterling Global's controlling shares. The desperate board accepted the lowball offer immediately, practically begging the syndicate to take the toxic company off their hands to avoid total liquidation. On a rainy Monday morning, the heavy mahogany doors of the executive boardroom swung open. The terrified executives stood up to greet their new savior and owner. Walking through the door was not a Wall Street billionaire, but Elias Thorne. He wasn't bowing his head. He wasn't carrying a coffee tray. He was wearing a bespoke navy suit, holding the legally binding acquisition contract. Elias hadn't just destroyed Victor, he had artificially manipulated the market to crash the company's value, allowing him to legally purchase his abuser's multi-billion-dollar empire for a fraction of its true worth. He calmly walked over to Victor's massive executive chair, sat down, smiled at the stunned executives, and gently whispered, "I prefer my coffee black now." How does a victim legally steal his abuser's kingdom in broad daylight? In dark psychology, this is known as the engineered power vacuum and legitimate usurpation. Predators like Victor believe power is permanently tied to their physical presence. But Elias understood that financial markets are driven purely by fear. By timing the FBI raid and the blackmail release perfectly, Elias manufactured an uncontrollable, psychological panic. He didn't steal the company. He orchestrated a crisis so severe that the board voluntarily handed him the keys just to survive the fire he secretly started. The seventh law of power in the game of revenge: never illegally steal what you can legally buy for pennies. The ultimate revenge is not burning your enemy's empire to the ground. It is watching them get dragged away in a police car while you sign the legal deed to their house. Part 8: The Trojan Realization. What destroys a predator faster than being locked in a cage? The sudden, horrifying realization that the cage was built by the exact prey he thought he had eaten. Today, we decode the dark psychology of retrospective realization and the collapse of the narcissistic ego. Victor Sterling was rotting in a sterile, maximum security federal visitation room in upstate New York. Despite losing his money and his empire, Victor's massive ego was still alive. He demanded a meeting with Elias Thorne. Victor convinced himself that Elias was just a lucky tech nerd who stumbled into a fortunate situation. When Elias finally walked into the visitation room, Victor sneered. Elias wasn't carrying a coffee tray, he was wearing a $10 bespoke suit. Carrying himself with the exact same terrifying, cold authority Victor used to possess. Victor slammed his fists on the table. Trying to re-establish dominance, he threatened Elias, screaming that he still had hidden loyalists in the tech underworld who would hack Thorne Capital to the ground. "You got lucky, you little rat," Victor spat. "Who helped you? Who breached my firewall? I spent $50 million on that cybersecurity grid. Tell me how you broke in." Elias didn't flinch. He didn't break eye contact. Slowly, he reached into his tailored pocket and placed a small, harmless-looking object into the security transfer tray. It was Victor's old, hollowed-out wireless presentation clicker. Elias slid it through the glass. "No one hacked you from the outside, Victor," Elias whispered softly, his voice chillingly calm. "Your firewall was perfect, but you demanded I kneel under your desk and plug this directly into your secure server every single morning for 5 years. You didn't just invite the Trojan horse inside, you threatened to punish me if I didn't feed it." Victor froze. His mind violently flashed back to thousands of memories, Elias bowing his head, kneeling on the floor, submissively plugging in cables. The bowing wasn't defeat, it was an assassin meticulously taking aim. How does a genius cope with absolute humiliation? In dark psychology, this is known as retrospective pattern recognition and narcissistic collapse. A grandiose narcissist like Victor builds a psychological fortress around their self-image as an untouchable god. When Elias revealed the clicker, he forced Victor's brain to retroactively process the last 5 years not as a reign of absolute dominance, but as a 5-year-long suicide. The realization that he had enthusiastically handed the murder weapon to his own killer, simply to satisfy his sadistic ego, caused Victor's psychological fortress to instantly and violently shatter. The eighth law of power in the game of revenge: submission is not always surrender. Sometimes. It is the perfect stance for an assassin taking aim. Never assume a bowed head means a broken spirit. The man who willingly kneels at your feet is in the absolute perfect position to slit your throat. Part 9: The Loyalty Virus. How do you permanently erase a dictator from history? You don't just destroy his statues. You buy the absolute silence of the people who used to worship him. Today, we decode the dark psychology of weaponized generosity and the illusion of free will. Elias Thorne officially took the helm of the newly rebranded Thorne Media. Victor Sterling had ruled his empire through sheer terror, creating a toxic corporate culture where executives obeyed purely out of fear. Elias knew that if he simply acted like another tyrant, or if he fired Victor's old loyalists, he would spark an immediate corporate civil war. Instead, Elias initiated a systematic and terrifying legacy purge. He physically removed every portrait, plaque, and award bearing Victor's name. But the real purge was psychological. Elias called every senior executive into his office one by one. These were the exact same arrogant men who used to mock Elias when he was Victor's broken bag carrier. They walked into the mahogany office sweating profusely, fully expecting to be brutally fired and blacklisted from the industry. They sat down, trembling, waiting for the executioner's axe to fall. Instead of handing them termination letters, Elias handed them envelopes. Inside were massive, unconditional financial bonuses. He doubled their salaries, fully vested their stock options, and quietly paid off their children's Ivy League tuitions. Elias smiled warmly. Victor was a monster who held you hostage. Elias whispered, playing the perfect savior, I am setting you free. The executives practically wept with gratitude, instantly pledging their absolute, undying loyalty to Elias. But Elias wasn't acting out of kindness. He had mathematically calculated the exact amount of money required to elevate their lifestyles to a level of extreme luxury. He made them so perfectly comfortable, and so deeply financially dependent on his generosity, that they could never afford to leave or challenge him. Elias didn't remove Victor's collar. He simply replaced it with handcuffs made of solid gold. How do you conquer an army without shedding a single drop of blood? In dark psychology, this is known as benevolent domination and the reciprocity trap. Fear is a highly volatile management tool. A terrified dog might eventually bite you if cornered. But weaponized generosity creates a profound, paralyzing psychological debt by acting as the benevolent savior who rescued them from Victor's reign of terror. Elias triggered the ultimate reciprocity principle. The executives became fiercely loyal not because they respected Elias, but because their newfound luxurious survival was entirely dependent on his continuous mercy. They became willing, enthusiastic slaves to their own comfort. The ninth law of power in the game of revenge. A cage made of gold is infinitely harder to escape than a cage made of iron. If you want absolute obedience from your subjects, do not threaten them with pain. Overwhelm them with a level of comfort they are utterly terrified of losing. Part 10: The Blank Bullet. How do you stop your worst enemy from hiring an assassin to kill you? You don't build a higher wall. You secretly pay the assassin to load his sniper rifle with blank bullets. Today, we decode the dark psychology of controlled opposition. Victor Sterling was bleeding, but he wasn't dead yet. From his maximum security federal cell, Victor planned his ultimate revenge. He liquidated his remaining legal funds to hire Robert Vance, the most ruthless, feared, and uncorruptible appellate attorney in New York. Victor told Robert the entire truth about Elias Thorne, the hollowed-out USB clicker, the ghost algorithm, and the orchestrated hostile takeover. Armed with this explosive narrative, Robert drafted a massive federal appeal. For 6 months, Robert visited Victor in prison, assuring the fallen billionaire that they had Elias completely cornered. Robert promised that the upcoming hearing would not only free Victor but send Elias to federal prison for corporate espionage. Victor finally felt the intoxicating rush of hope. He smiled in his cell, eagerly waiting for the day he would watch Elias's empire crumble in court. The day of the federal appeal arrived. Victor sat in the courtroom, grinning with arrogant anticipation. But as Robert Vance stood up to present the case, something went terribly wrong. Robert, the brilliant legal mind, began making catastrophic procedural errors. He accidentally missed the filing deadline for the crucial cyber forensics evidence, rendering it entirely inadmissible. The irritated federal judge dismissed the appeal with prejudice, meaning Victor could never legally appeal this case again. As guards dragged a screaming, hysterical Victor out of the courtroom, Robert calmly packed his briefcase. He walked out of the courthouse and stepped directly into a waiting black SUV. Sitting in the back was Elias Thorne. Elias smiled and handed Robert a pristine envelope containing the only copy of a blackmail file proving Robert had fabricated evidence early in his career. A secret Elias had found inside Victor's own digital vault. How do you perfectly neutralize a rebellion? In dark psychology, this is known as controlled opposition and the false hope trap. Elias knew that if he openly fought Victor's lawyer, Victor might find another angle of attack. Instead, Elias used the shadow leverage to secretly own Victor's champion. By letting Victor believe he had a fighting chance, Elias kept Victor distracted and compliant for 6 months. When you control the enemy's leader, you control the outcome of the war. Elias didn't just defeat Victor's legal defense, he weaponized Victor's own hope to permanently seal his prison cell. The 10th law of power in the game of revenge. The most flawless way to win a war is to secretly command both armies. The illusion of a fair fight is the deadliest trap. If your enemy's sword is secretly dull, you can let them swing at your neck all day. Part 11: The Phantom Assassin. How do you torture a king who has already lost his crown, his gold, and his freedom? You don't take his life. You take his sanity. Today, we decode the dark psychology of induced paranoia and the phantom threat. Victor Sterling was finally broken. Confined to a maximum security federal prison, he had accepted his miserable fate. He had no money, no lawyers, and no hope. He believed Elias had taken everything there was to take. But a master predator never leaves a survivor comfortable. On a quiet Tuesday, Elias Thorne visited Victor one last time. Elias didn't come to gloat. He looked at the hollow, exhausted shell of the former billionaire through the glass. I brought you a parting gift, Victor, Elias whispered softly. He slid a piece of paper through the security slot. It was a list of 5 names. Victor stared at the paper, confused. They were the names of 5 violent inmates currently serving life sentences in Victor's exact cell block. Victor looked up, his hands trembling. What is this? He rasped. Elias smiled warmly. I now control a $10 billion empire. Victor, I have unlimited resources. 3 of the men on that list are secretly on my payroll. Their families are currently living in luxury penthouses in Manhattan. Their only job is to watch you. Elias leaned closer to the glass. They won't kill you today. They might not kill you next year. But one day, when you are eating in the cafeteria, or sleeping in your cell, one of them will earn his paycheck. Good luck guessing which 3 they are. Elias stood up and walked away, leaving Victor hyperventilating, staring in absolute terror at the inmates walking behind him in the reflection of the glass. How do you build a prison inside a prison? In dark psychology, this is known as induced paranoia and the phantom threat. Physical torture has limits because the human body eventually goes numb. But psychological torture is infinite. By planting the idea of a hidden assassin, Elias ensured that Victor's amygdala, the brain's fear center, would never shut off. Victor will never sleep deeply. He will never trust a plate of food. He will never speak to another human being without wondering if they are holding a hidden blade. Elias didn't need to actually hire anyone. The mere suggestion of the threat was enough to make Victor's own brain torture him for the rest of his life. The 11th law of power in the game of revenge. The most terrifying weapon is the one your enemy cannot see. You do not need to strike a man to break him. You simply need to convince him that the blade is already hovering above his neck in the dark. Part 12: The Bloody Loop. What is the ultimate curse of the man who successfully murders the king? He must spend the rest of his life sitting on the exact same bloody throne, waiting for his own assassin. Today, we decode the eternal cycle of power and the terrifying paranoia of the usurper. Elias Thorne had won. He successfully absorbed the ashes of Sterling Global into Thorne Media, creating the single largest media and tech conglomerate in America. He lived in a $50 million Manhattan penthouse, flew in Victor's private jet, and held the blackmail keys to the highest politicians in the country. Elias swore to himself that he would never be a sadistic tyrant like Victor. He treated his employees with respect and paid them handsomely. But 5 years into his supreme reign, the psychological weight of absolute power began to fracture his mind. He started noticing the behavior of the executives he had bought with golden handcuffs. They never argued with him. They agreed with his worst ideas. To manage his massive workload, Elias hired a new chief of staff, a brilliant, quiet young tech prodigy named Julian. Julian was perfect. He wore plain suits, anticipated Elias's every need, never asked for credit, and always bowed his head submissively when spoken to. One evening, Elias walked into the dark boardroom to prepare for a meeting. He stopped dead in his tracks. Julian was quietly kneeling under the mahogany desk, plugging in a presentation cable. Elias froze. His heart pounded violently against his ribs. It was the exact same posture, the exact same submissive camouflage Elias had used to destroy Victor. Elias panicked. He secretly hired private investigators to audit Julian. He checked the servers for ghost algorithms. He tore the presentation clickers apart looking for microtransmitters. He found absolutely nothing. Julian was just a loyal kid doing his job. But the psychological damage was permanent. Elias fired Julian the next day without cause. Then he fired his security chief. Then he locked himself in his penthouse. Elias realized that because he had proven a perfectly submissive servant could be a lethal assassin, he could never trust a bowed head again. How does a genius build an empire only to lock himself in a mental cage? In dark psychology, this is known as usurper's paranoia and the projection of treason. When you achieve supreme power through deception and infiltration, your brain permanently maps submission as a lethal threat. Elias projected his own past predatory behavior onto every innocent person around him. He didn't become Victor in cruelty, but he became Victor in his absolute, terrifying isolation. He realized that the throne doesn't change the nature of the game, it only changes who the target is. The 12th and final law of power in the game of revenge. The man who teaches the world how to slit the king's throat must sleep with one eye open forever. Vengeance is a perfect circle. You may have successfully stolen the crown, but you have also inherited the ghosts that haunt it. Thank you for following the series. He bowed his head, only to slit the king's throat. The throne may change owners, but the shadows in the room remain the exact same. If this masterclass in dark psychology opened your eyes, do not leave your mind unguarded. Hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and click the notification bell so you never miss a lesson in survival. If you were Elias, could you have escaped the paranoia? Or is the curse of the crown inevitable? Let us know your thoughts down below. Until next time, trust no one who bows too low. Stay vigilant, and we will see you in the next video.